They killed a man in front of his wife in his home.
A widow's anguish after she called police to help her husband and he ended up shot dead in their own home. A Channel 2 Action News Atlanta Journal-Constitution investigation found that happened in more than a third of all Georgia police shootings in the past 5 years. Channel 2's investigative reporter Jody Fleischer is here with the stunning trend and how it could impact your family. Jody.
Jovita, what we learned from digging into all of these cases is that they aren't just bad guys getting killed in the middle of a robbery. This could happen to any family, calling for help when a loved one is suicidal or on drugs or having a mental crisis. Several had committed no crime, had no weapon, and all of the officers were found to be justified anyway.
And we want to know what happened to her and why she's dead.
There is no question Lori Knowles called 911 for help.
I'm so ready to help. I need help right now.
Her husband was rushing home and also called 911.
She is bipolar and she takes medication. She told me that she took too much of her medication. Please don't hurt her.
But police had already shot his wife. They forced their way into the home when she didn't answer the door. She had a gun at her side.
The officers tried to get her to comply with orders to show her hands, but she made an offensive movement towards the weapon.
Channel 2 Action News and the Atlanta Journal-Constitution examined nearly 170 cases of Georgians shot and killed by police in the past 5 years. Roughly 40% were shot at their own home or a relative's home.
Life can change in a second. You lose your whole world.
For Tanisha Fellio, that happened in December 2010 when she called police to her Lawrenceville home to help her husband.
It scared me because I never seen him that way, ever.
After 6 years of marriage, James Fellio had suddenly turned violent. She wanted a mental evaluation and waited for him to fall asleep to ease the police encounter. But within 10 minutes of waking him, police shot him, saying he tried to grab an officer's gun.
It's like life is not valued. You took away somebody's husband, somebody's daddy.
Roughly half of those shot at home were experiencing some sort of mental break or were suicidal.
Who killed him? Who shot him?
Pure anguish from the father of James Clark, who had tried to kill himself after a romantic breakup. A friend called Gwinnett Police for help.
She told me to leave right now. It's not safe for me to be there, and I'm worried about him.
James sat in his driveway with a gun at his side. Police repeatedly ordered him to drop it. He stood and walked toward police, and they shot him.
Something occurred where the officers felt threatened.
It was my baby. It was my youngest son.
His family will never understand.
Let's shoot a suicidal person? Is that how they deal with things here?
Dwight Person was visiting his nephew when East Point police raided looking for drugs. They say Person made a threatening gesture. The 54-year-old veteran was unarmed. Christopher Roop's only crime was answering the door with a video game controller in his hand. Hugh Harley police were looking for his dad. But records show nearly half of the shot-at-home cases actually started with a call for help.
We were devastated.
Delisa Davis's brother Kevin called 911 after a roommate attacked his girlfriend.
He called to be protected and served. You know, instead they came in and they killed him.
The DeKalb officer says no one answered, so he opened the apartment door and Kevin's dog ran out. The officer shot the dog, then moments later shot Kevin, who had grabbed his gun thinking the attacker had returned. Kevin was still on the phone with 911.
Why didn't you give him an opportunity to drop the gun? You know, he's in his own home.
Now, to be fair, we also saw many times where officers clearly had no choice but to shoot. In several, the suspect fired at officers first. In about 24 cases, the suspects were in the middle of committing crimes, some violent crimes. Another dozen were wanted on warrants. Experts say entering an unfamiliar home is one of the most dangerous things an officer can do.
So a lot of information here, Jody, and in your other part of this series last week. How did you find all of this? And is someone keeping track of these sort of at-home shootings involving police officers?
Well, surprisingly, no Georgia agency tracks all of this. The GBI investigates lots of the cases, but there's little analysis of trends. Now, we dug through the case files, death records, and recordings, tracking every single case we could find, nearly 170 total, and we still aren't sure we found them all.
Probably just up to the families,
right,
to keep them out there.
Yes, yeah. Absolutely.
Jody, thank you. You can take a closer look at the dozens of cases right from your phone on our WSB-TV News app or WSB-TV.com. From your phone, you can scroll through the cases and get detailed information on each. New questions in a case involving Union City Police. One officer told us a fellow officer should not have been cleared in the shooting death of an unarmed teenager. A Channel 2 Action News Atlanta Journal-Constitution investigation found an expert said the 2011 shooting could not have happened the way the officer claimed, and there were no witnesses. Channel 2's investigative reporter Jody Fleischer is here with what else she found that the grand jury never heard. Jody?
Jovita, it's been 3.5 years since Ariston Waiter's death, but his mother's wounds haven't even begun to heal. She keeps hearing new details the grand jury never heard. We tracked down a half dozen officers who each tell part of the story, and some question whether their fellow officer was over the line.
Hey, I got this one.
Union City, December 2011. An unarmed black teenager shot twice in the back while already lying face down on the ground.
I just went to screaming and hollering, no, 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 my son is not dead.
Frida Waiter's son Ariston had taken off running after a fight between teenagers. Officer Luther Lewis caught up to him.
And the way he said the story happened, that's impossible.
My mind's telling me he's fixing to pull a gun out, and I'm like freaking flipping out.
In this previously undisclosed video, Lewis used a GBI agent to show how he says Ariston tried to grab his gun, reaching behind and up from the ground.
Yes, and I went with everything I had. Bam, bam.
But an expert found Lewis's statements to be inconsistent with the forensic evidence and called his actions contrary to all standards, with a disregard for human life that is unacceptable.
Even if the deceased in this case had physically defended himself, that he had a right to do it because he was being illegally arrested.
But in May 2012, a grand jury voted not to charge Lewis with felony murder, false imprisonment, or violating his oath.
What I told the grand jury that night is the type of person I am. Had someone else had a gun and been shooting that night and Ariston Waiter was standing there, I would have put him behind me and I would have took a bullet.
Lewis talked to Channel 2 right after the grand jury, but refuses to talk about the case now. The Justice Department declined to intervene.
No, I was actually waiting to hear from the FBI.
Union City officer Chris McElroy was the first supervisor to arrive after the shooting. He has never spoken publicly about what he heard and saw.
It's not set right with me from the very first time I arrived on the scene.
He says at first, Lewis made no mention of a struggle for the gun, instead saying Waiters was hiding one of his hands. But McElroy says the chief told him not to write a statement and later bragged about keeping Lewis out of prison. Was this a good shoot in your mind?
Not in my mind.
A few months earlier, in the Brookstone neighborhood, McElroy rolled up on Lewis with his gun pointed in another suspect's back.
When Officer Lewis explained that he suspected the young man had something in his pocket and he couldn't get his hands out and said I was fixing to shoot him.
Lewis also used force on Royal South Parkway a year before the Waiters shooting. He fired 4 rounds, claiming someone had shot at him, but investigators questioned whether it really happened.
Everyone had concerns that he had issues.
A captain had already counseled Lewis, concerned he was suffering from PTSD. A sergeant wrote him up after a raid where Lewis saw movement in a house that turned out to be empty. But Lewis's disciplinary file was also empty.
The files that we received from the police department were not that helpful.
The DA says he was not aware of Lewis's history, so neither was the grand jury.
Listening to what you're saying today, I'm going to be looking very closely at representing it.
Frida Waiters just wants everyone to know the truth.
And my son is dead and gone. I can't get him back. But I am going to get justice for my son.
Now, since our meeting with the district attorney on Wednesday, he has already met with the GBI agents who worked the case, and they've started interviewing all of the officers we spoke with. Now, Officer Luther Lewis has always maintained that the shooting was justified and that he was in fear for his life.
And Jody, where is Lewis now? Is he still working with Union City Police?
He's not. He actually left the department last year amid concerns about PTSD following the Waiters shooting. But because that was considered a voluntary resignation, Union City never reported it to the state, and he is still certified to go work in another department.
All right, Jody, thank you.
Channel 2 Action News and the Atlanta Journal-Constitution asked a leading DNA expert to review 2 lab reports and the death of an unarmed teenager. And just last week, the Fulton County District Attorney reopened his case against the officer who shot Ariston Waiters after our investigation revealed new evidence. Channel 2 investigative reporter Jody Fleischer live at the Fulton County Courthouse with what that expert said. Jody.
Well, Justin, he said the same thing the GBI said, that the DNA evidence in this case is absolutely inconclusive. But that's not what we've been hearing for years from the police department and the officer's own attorney. Now it could all become an issue again as the district attorney considers taking this case to a new grand jury.
As a scientist, I can tell you that there's no identification of Mr. Waiters. We don't know if he touched this gun.
It's an issue that's been at the heart of the case since December 2011, when a Union City police officer shot 19-year-old Ariston Waiters twice in the back.
Yes, and I went with everything I had. Bam, bam.
As Officer Luther Lewis showed GBI agents in this demonstration, he says Waiters tried to grab his gun while the teen was already lying face down on the ground. So investigators had the gun tested for Waiters' DNA.
Well, there's no identification except for Officer Lewis. There's at least 3 contributors on that gun.
But listen to what Officer Lewis's defense attorney was telling everyone back in 2012 when the case originally went to a grand jury.
There was DNA on the gun that would have come from the skin cells from Mr. Waiters, which proves that Waiters had his hand and was trying to get the gun away.
And just 2 weeks ago from the Union City Assistant Police Chief.
Ariston Waiters' DNA was on the gun.
In fact, the first lab report from the GBI said there was no conclusive determination when it came to Waiters' DNA. A second report from a private lab said Waiters could not be excluded from one sample and could be a possible minor contributor to another.
If you want to really stretch it, I think 1 in 25 people might be included. And when you think about that, that's 400,000 Georgians. So it's not an identification.
He says even if the teen's DNA was on the gun, it doesn't necessarily prove he grabbed for it.
The officer's trying to put cuffs on. If he's touching like that, he's going to be rubbing. That kind of transfer, the officer could have picked up DNA from Mr. Waiters quite easily and transferred it to his weapon as well.
Now, that expert told me just because Waiters' DNA wasn't conclusively on the gun doesn't mean that he didn't struggle for the gun. He says sometimes the DNA just doesn't transfer. Reporting live in Fulton County, Jody Fleischer, Channel 2 Action News.
2 grand juries, no indictment. All new at 6. Tonight, Fulton County's district attorney says he may seek a federal investigation into the police shooting that killed this teenager. Good evening, I'm Justin Farmer.
I'm Jovita Moore. This decision comes now that a grand jury voted not to indict the police officer. The Fulton County DA reopened this case after a Channel 2 Action News Atlanta Journal-Constitution investigation revealed new evidence. Channel 2's investigative reporter Jody Fleischer is live in our newsroom with new developments today and why the DA is being persistent. Jody?
Jovita, District Attorney Paul Howard told me he firmly believes that officer committed crimes when he shot an unarmed teen in the back. And Howard says he's won other cases with much less evidence. But in this one, because Georgia law allows officers to be in the grand jury room and make a tearful closing statement, he believes emotions won out over evidence.
I think that the force that was used in this case was excessive, and I think that he should have been indicted.
Fulton District Attorney Paul Howard says he was confident in his case against former Union City police officer Luther Lewis when he took it to a grand jury for the second time. Lewis shot 19-year-old Ariston Waiters twice in the back. The teen had run when police arrived to break up a neighborhood fight he'd been watching. Some of Lewis's fellow officers even testified against him.
And we thought it was convincing, but as I said, we always know that there's this 800-pound gorilla waiting for us.
That gorilla is a Georgia law which allows officers the unique privilege of sitting in the grand jury room and hearing all of the witnesses and evidence against them before making a closing statement. They can say whatever they want for as long as they want. Sources tell us Lewis was crying throughout the case.
Without the ability of the state to cross-examine that person or the grand jurors to ask questions of that person, that emotion is generated in an unabated fashion.
Howard says Lewis violated Waiters' rights because the teen had committed no crime. If he was being illegally arrested, he had the right to resist. A local district attorney only has 2 tries to bring a case for indictment, and an earlier grand jury also cleared Lewis in 2012.
In the federal court system, there is no right for the officer to be at the grand jury and to make a statement, a sworn statement. So that might be the last option in this case.
This most recent grand jury considered even more charges than the first: felony murder, involuntary manslaughter, aggravated assault, false imprisonment, and violation of oath. Now, we tried to reach Luther Lewis for comment today, but he did not return our calls. Live in the newsroom, Jody Fleischer, Channel 2 Action News.
Something is wrong with the system, and it needs to be fixed.
Grand jurors, prosecutors, even the GBI is speaking out about a Georgia law that gives special treatment and in some cases can block justice. A Channel 2 Action News Atlanta Journal-Constitution investigation examined 170 police shooting deaths in the past 5 years. Not one officer went to trial. Georgia is the only state that allows officers to hear all the grand jury evidence against them before making a closing statement. Investigative reporter Jody Fleischer here now with why some want that law to change.
Justin, the rest of us don't get to address the grand jury if we're accused of a crime. Prosecutors told me they've seen officers lie and not been able to call them out on it. Grand jurors said officers were so emotional they just couldn't indict them. We spoke with half a dozen DAs, the GBI director. They all agree on two things. Overwhelmingly, most officer shootings are justified. But in Georgia, the ones that are not are too hard to indict.
Just a very loving, friendly man.
This family remembers Walter Wayne Folds as a good man and a great father. But the night before he died, he cut his estranged wife with a box cutter when she surprised him in their darkened home. The next morning, they agreed to meet in a park so he could see his kids. But Griffin police showed up to meet him instead.
There's a lot of questions need to be answered.
Like why Officer Joseph Hudson chased Folds into the woods. In a struggle to cuff him, the officer was scratched with that box cutter. He got Folds on the ground and shot him in the back of the head.
It's not right. He took a life that he cannot give back.
A grand jury thought so too, indicting Officer Hudson for involuntary manslaughter. The district attorney dropped the charge the next day.
I didn't think we'd get a conviction.
The DA made the decision after hearing Sergeant Hudson tell the grand jury it was self-defense.
I was offended by the officer's actions.
So why not prosecute it?
Because you're in this gray area between probable cause and proof beyond a reasonable doubt.
Georgia is the only state that allows officers to be in the grand jury room and hear the evidence against them before making a closing statement.
No one else in this state runs toward the danger of an armed individual.
The Georgia Sheriff's Association says officers deserve the right to explain the split-second decisions they're forced to make. But we found even when GBI investigators think it's a crime, nothing happens to the officers.
That is a problem. I don't know that it serves the interest of justice in the end.
This grand juror thought the police shooting of an unarmed mother was criminal, but just couldn't vote against the officers.
It was like, they were sitting there. I felt bad for the policemen. They had tears all in their eyes and crying.
Plus, the law prohibits prosecutors or grand jurors from questioning what the officers say.
Have they said things that I didn't believe were factual? Yes.
The DeKalb DA now has a civil grand jury review every case, but that's rare. We combed through all 171 cases and found well over half cleared by prosecutors. Only 9 went to a grand jury to consider charges.
There's something that sometimes seems to trump facts, and that something is emotion.
The Fulton DA tried twice to indict Union City officer Luther Lewis for murder. He shot and killed an unarmed teen twice in the back, but in a tearful closing statement, Lewis claimed the teen tried to reach up and grab his gun.
If he didn't make the statement he made, do you feel you would have gotten an indictment?
I think we would have.
The only Georgia officer in the last 5 years indicted for a deadly police shooting was that Griffin officer who killed Walter Wayne Folds.
They could have carried him to jail, and he could have been tried for whatever he had done.
Geraldine Jackson served on that grand jury and now wonders why the DA even brought the case since he didn't take the officer to trial.
Something is wrong with the system, and it needs to be fixed.
Officer Hudson is still on the job in Griffin. He did not return our call for comment. Georgia's grand jury law also gives similar special treatment to other public officials. It was given decades ago to protect against politically motivated prosecutions. Any changes would have to come from the legislature. Justin?
A Channel 2 Action News investigation exposed special treatment for officers during cases of deadly force.
Now that we know, doing nothing is not an option.
New at 6, the changes prosecutors want to make and the impact it could have on cases across Georgia.
Live, local, late breaking. This is Channel 2 Action News at 6 p.m. Coverage you can count on.
Good evening. I'm Craig Lucy in for Justin Farmer.
I'm Jovita Moore. Prosecutors say that special treatment makes it nearly impossible to indict an officer. A series of Channel 2 Action News and Atlanta Journal-Constitution investigations expose flaws in the current law regarding officers and grand juries. Channel 2's investigative reporter Jody Fleischer is live with the changes prosecutors want now. Jody?
Jovita, we've spotlighted several cases this year which raised serious questions about the grand jury process here in Georgia. It's different from every other state. Not one of our deadly officer shootings in the last 5 years went to trial. Now the state's prosecutors and a powerful legislator want to change the law to eliminate some of that special treatment, which can stack the deck in officers' favor.
Prosecutors say it's cases like this one that explain their frustration. An unarmed teen who'd committed no crime, shot in the back by an officer. The DA called it murder. Then the officer tearfully told his side after hearing all of the evidence against him. 2 different grand juries voted not to indict him.
There's no doubt that some of the cases that have been in the news lately have drawn that more public attention to it.
Georgia's Prosecuting Attorneys Council says now is the time to change state law. Last week, our investigation revealed not one of the last 171 deadly police shootings went to trial.
There's some issues with the integrity of the system when the accused is actually present during the entire presentation of evidence.
Georgia is the only state that allows officers facing possible indictment to sit in on the entire grand jury process, hear all of the witnesses, and then make a closing statement that cannot be questioned or challenged by prosecutors or grand jurors.
The process itself inside that room has got to be above question.
Representative Rich Golick chairs the committee that would change the law and now plans to champion that effort.
This is the first time that I've, sensed a push coming. And then when you combine that with real-world examples of how the process potentially has been undermined, that's a situation that demands us to take a hard look at it.
The prosecutors say officers should come in, make their statement, be cross-examined, and then leave the room like any other witness, but that the officers should still be an important part of the process.
Nobody knows what those guys are faced with until you've done that job, until you've made those kind of decisions in the dark of night when you're off by yourself in the middle of nowhere, and that the grand jury needs to hear from them if they want to be heard.
The police chiefs and sheriff's associations fought attempts to change this law years ago, but prosecutors say the climate has changed. They're hoping to work with law enforcement to come up with legislation they can all agree on. Now, there's also a push to have the officers' statements recorded with a transcript that could become public later to increase transparency.
Caroline Small died after a low-speed chase with officers, and even the GBI agent who supervised the investigation says the shooting was not justified. But Channel 2 investigative reporter Jody Fleischer here with questions that she's uncovered about what the grand jury heard and did not hear. Jody.
Justin, the district attorney has absolute discretion over which witnesses and evidence a grand jury hears. But when we dug through her files after these officers were cleared, we found she cut a deal with them and agreed not to show the grand jury their indictment. Plus, she used evidence the GBI says was inaccurate and created by police to protect officers who were over the line.
It's been 5 years since gunshots shattered Caroline Small's windshield and Gabby McGuire's faith in the justice system.
It never sounded right. Never, ever.
Gabby named her transitional house Caroline's in honor of the friend she lost at the hands of 2 Glenn County police officers.
I talked to her the night before she was shot. She was not okay in her head.
Caroline was in therapy for mental illness and had battled addiction since she was a teen. During her sober years, she helped other women struggling like her.
She was very loving, a very good mother. She loved life.
We'll never know why she took off when an officer approached her car, but her family's attorney is even more baffled by what happened next.
There's no question she bears a great deal of responsibility for what happened to her. She deserved to go to jail. She didn't deserve to die.
Caroline was unarmed and riding on rims with her car pinned by police.
There was nothing in my mind that justified them shooting her.
Rick Curry was the Waycross district attorney who reviewed the case for the Glenn DA.
They should have been prosecuted. There's no doubt about that.
He says if this trooper was in fear for his life, he wouldn't have tried to get Caroline out of the car, only retreating once officers Corey Sasser and Todd Simpson pointed their guns.
Everything was right there on the tape. I really don't know how the grand jury didn't indict.
We wanted to find out. from courthouse records.
We were not handed anything like this.
And grand jurors who were there.
She definitely wasn't pushing for an indictment, no question about that.
Glynn County District Attorney Jackie Johnson refused our requests for an on-camera interview. We wanted to ask about these deals she made with the officers, agreeing not to present this indictment she'd written for felony murder, manslaughter, and violation of oath.
I think I voted the wrong way. We need to hear the whole side. He should have went to regular court.
But it didn't. Byron Bennett says with no deliberation, they voted once by show of hands. It's haunted him from the moment he left the courthouse.
We failed that lady. We failed the process.
That's not any kind of grand jury I've ever been a part of.
GBI agent Mike McDaniel supervised the investigation.
Do you think something needed to happen to these officers?
Yes, I do.
But the DA allowed police to counter the GBI and present details from their own investigation, which cleared the officers, including this animation created to show how Caroline could have run them over and escaped.
Those measurements in that cartoon are not correct.
Records show the police chief had discussed the case with the brand new DA before she even took office.
Your department produced an inaccurate video and then gave it to the district attorney to use in her grand jury proceeding.
Well, you have to understand, the DA had the choice to accept that and present it. She didn't have to present that.
Gabby says even 5 years later, the truth needs to be told.
Bringing it out to light is the best thing. Will it save Caroline's life? No, but it might save somebody else's life.
We also found records showing the DA gave copies of the evidence in the case to the officers' defense attorneys 2 months before the grand jury. That's practically unheard of before an arrest or indictment. The grand jury voted 12-6 to clear the officers. Both are still certified and working.
So, Jody, does the family have any other recourse here?
Well, not for a criminal case unless the district attorney chooses to take it to a new grand jury. But Caroline's family did file suit in federal court, and that judge also sided with the officers, throwing out the case before it could get to a jury.
All right, Jody, thank you for this. You can read more about this case from our news partners in Sunday's Atlanta Journal-Constitution.
Sometimes the cover-up was worse than the crime, and the crime was bad enough.
4 former prosecutors are speaking out tonight, accusing their former boss of intentionally mishandling this horrific police shooting. And as a Channel 2 Action News Atlanta Journal-Constitution investigation exposed this summer, the South Georgia District Attorney took extraordinary measures to help clear those officers. Investigative reporter Jody Fleischer here with why many on the DA's staff thought her actions were over the line.
Justin, the GBI agent who supervised this investigation told us Caroline Small's killing was the worst police shooting he'd ever seen. In July, we exposed records showing how the district attorney who took those officers to a grand jury stacked the deck in their favor. Our reporting prompted several of her former prosecutors to come forward in an effort to right the wrongs that have troubled them for 5 years.
This makes me angry. She's giving them. There was no one in our office given this.
Former Glynn County Prosecutor David Peterson could not believe the records our investigation uncovered. District Attorney Jackie Johnson, his former boss, had made a deal with 2 police officers she was supposed to be considering charging. She took the case to a grand jury, but never showed them an indictment.
I think the grand jury here was undercut, misused, and abused, and they were lied to.
The grand jury cleared officers Corey Sasser and Todd Simpson of a police shooting so shocking none of these prosecutors could believe their eyes. Caroline Small had committed no crime that morning. She drove off when an officer walked up to check on her in a mall parking lot. She drove erratically, eventually blocked in by a utility pole and several patrol cars. On video, one officer said if she moved again, he was going to shoot her. Then they did.
This was a murder and was covered up.
Jonathan Miller resigned to run against Johnson in 2012, in part because of her handling of this case. He said it still troubles him.
There's 2 little kids out there that don't have a mama. She deserves her day in court.
Keith Higgins was a senior prosecutor in Johnson's office. He's broken down in tears over how the justice system failed.
It has affected me very deeply in that regard, and that someone was very brutally killed unnecessarily, and nothing has been done about it.
He says the officers' claims that they feared for their lives did not hold up against the video and other evidence. The Glynn Police Department took extraordinary steps to protect its officers, creating this inaccurate animation. It shows how Small could have run over the officers, which the investigation proved impossible. The DA showed it to the grand jury anyway.
A prosecutor should do what's right, do it in the right way, and do it for the right reason. Ms. Johnson failed to do any of those in this case.
He says with no indictment presented, the officers had no right to be in the grand jury room. Johnson also allowed their attorneys to speak, which is unheard of, and she'd given them all of the evidence 2 months earlier.
So who the hell is representing the public? Who the hell is representing Carolyn Small?
Johnson excluded those who best knew the evidence, fired colleagues who wanted the case prosecuted, and even a victim's advocate who questioned the lack of indictment.
We were frozen out of it. That was abnormal.
Peterson, who is also an ex-cop, believes Johnson violated prosecutorial ethics and betrayed her duty to uphold justice. He says she should be impeached.
Sometimes the cover-up was worse than the crime, and the crime was bad enough.
The former prosecutors are now calling on the governor and attorney general to review the case in hopes that the GBI will reopen it. Jackie Johnson declined our request for an interview, but sent a statement saying she took her oath seriously when she presented the case to the grand jury. She did not address any of the specifics from our investigation.
So give us a little something deeper here, Jody. What's the motivation here? Why would she go to these extremes?
Well, it's possible she may have just seen it differently than those other prosecutors, but they also say she was so concerned about damaging her relationship with the police department that it created a conflict of interest. Now remember, she is elected in a very pro-law enforcement community.
All right, Jody Fleischer, thank you for that. Caroline Small's family did file a civil suit in federal court that was dismissed by a judge, never went to jury. The two officers both remain in law enforcement today.
It's appalling, it's disgusting, it's sickening, and it's even worse when nothing is being done about it.
Attorneys and some families reacting to staggering details that we uncovered in our year-long investigation into Georgia police shootings. We looked at every deadly case in the past 5 years and found nearly half were unarmed, shot in the back, or both, and not one officer's been charged. Investigative reporter Jody Fleischer here now with how we've uncovered these trends.
Justin, we're talking about data no one else has tracked, so we and our news partners at the AJC spent a year digging through all of the case files, 184 of them, to answer key questions. Are blacks really targeted more often? Is the officer's life always in danger? And is it possible that every single one of these shootings was really justified?
I just kind of been there. Maybe it was something I could have done. Maybe this would not have happened.
Rosa Hampton's grief over losing her son Maurice is still just as raw as it was in June 2011 when he was shot by an Atlanta police officer.
Shot in the back, no weapon.
It's not as unusual as you might think. Records show 90 Georgians killed by police in the last 5 years were either unarmed, shot in the back, or both. That's nearly half of all 184 cases.
I have a problem with that because I just don't see the threat.
Attorney Max Richardson represented the Hampton family in a federal lawsuit.
It pierced my soul to lose a case like that, knowing what the family had to go through.
Maurice had no license and ran a stop sign. Then he ran from his van when the officer pulled him over. They tussled at the bottom of a hill. The only witness says Maurice looked like he was cuffed, but then broke away from the officer and ran again. That's when he was shot in the back. The absence of gunpowder suggests it was not close range.
The officer twisted the facts entirely in another direction.
Officer Thomas Atzert told a grand jury he used his pepper spray and baton, but that Maurice grabbed both away and began hitting him. His lawyer says the officer was in a fight for his life.
He pushed away and fired one shot to prevent him from turning around with a deadly weapon in his hand.
But prosecutors didn't believe that and tried to indict the officer for false statements, violating his oath, and murdering Maurice Hampton.
20 people who never met Officer Atzert listened to 19 hours of testimony and made a determination that Officer Atzert was telling the truth.
We obtained these never-released photos which show the officer's baton in Maurice's hand, but prosecutors thought the baton was planted and that Maurice may have been handcuffed before he was shot. Injuries to his teeth and face suggest he fell forward without using his hands to break his fall. One arm was cuffed when backup officers arrived, but Atzert said he did that after the shooting.
It was very concerning to me that we were looking at accusing everyone of a conspiracy when in fact there was evidence to support Officer Atzert's statement.
Grand jurors voted to clear the officer. In all 184 Georgia cases, not one officer has faced criminal charges.
They know that they can get away with it.
They know all they got to say is, I was in fear for my life.
Police files, autopsies, and court records all paint a picture of the lives lost. 69 were shot in their own home or that of a loved one. 1 in 4 had been treated for mental illness.
I would be devastated if nothing resulted from this, because we're not getting the job done. You know, we're not getting the true facts.
Atsert's attorney says the officer's fear of losing his own life and the grief of taking someone else's made this the worst day of the officer's life, and that he's still too distraught to talk about it. Plus, there is some indication the district attorney may try again for an indictment.
Okay, so Jody, every time we hear about another one of these shootings, the topic of race comes up. What did the numbers show in all of this?
It does, and that was actually really interesting. Out of the 184 shootings we examined, 89 of those killed were black, 87 were white. Percentage-wise, that's about half and half. Whites outnumber blacks in Georgia, though, by about 2 to 1. So they are more likely, blacks are more likely to be killed by police. Now, we've broken down those details and many more of the specifics on our website at WSB-TV.com.
Wow, year-long investigation. Thank you for that. Well, last night's case becomes the 185th deadly police shooting in Georgia in the last 5 years, just one day after we revealed results which show half of those killed were unarmed or shot in the back. The head of the agency that trains all Georgia officers is speaking out about what we uncovered. Investigative reporter Jody Fleischer is here now with what he says needs to change. Jody.
Well, Aaron, he says the biggest issue is officer training and what the trainers can glean from the data we gather that will help make all of us safer. Our investigation is the first time anyone has analyzed the details of every Georgia case, and he says state leaders are already talking about how to use what we found.
It is not easy to be a law enforcement officer. I don't know how we're recruiting people anymore.
The head of Georgia's Peace Officer Standards and Training Council says overwhelmingly most officers do the right thing, and most of the deadly officer-involved shootings are justified. But he says a Channel 2 Action News AJC investigation, which tracked all 184 cases in the past 5 years, did raise concerns.
We've got to adjust our training, and I think we will. I think Georgia's committed to doing the right thing.
He says our finding in nearly half of all the cases that 90 people killed were either unarmed, shot in the back, or both is staggering.
It puts in our face those raw, hard numbers that makes us say, whoa, we might need to look at this thing in a different way.
He supports an upcoming legislative effort by prosecutors to limit the special treatment officers get when they face a grand jury. Currently, Georgia is the only state where officers stay in the room, hear all of the evidence, then make an unchallenged closing statement. Out of 184 deadly shootings, not one officer has been charged.
That's troubling. That's really troubling. Have we had some bad shootings in Georgia? Yes. Will we have some in the future? Yes, but I hope we have less. Everybody at our level hopes we have less. This does not make us look good.
He says prosecuting the bad shootings would make the public more trusting of the rest, and creating live scenario-based training from the earlier cases will help, since officers are human.
Learn how we got to this point and then be transparent with a good third-party investigation after it's over with. And I think we build back that public trust.
The records also showed about 1 in every 4 of the people killed had been experiencing some sort of mental issues. The Post director told me that's definitely an area where officer training can also be improved. Justin?